Although everything that you see is necessary, or it wouldn't be here. And specifically on this planet, the nervous systems, if you can see it this far, of all so-called living three-dimensional creatures, from trees to dogs to humans, you can look at, but specifically the nervous system of humans you can look at quite properly as being a primary level necessity. Absolutely. Or man would not be, humanity would not be fulfilling the function that it obviously is fulfilling even by a cursory glance. Now, even though you can see the nervous system as being a three-dimensional primary level necessity, it can be useful, to say the least, to look upon the manifestations of it as being secondary. Now, in the greater scheme of things, from a more complex view, it would be true that no matter what humans do, no matter how transitory might be any manifestation of the human nervous system, you can look at that as being absolutely necessary. It would not be going on. But for the sake of trying to encourage your own intellect to get above its ordinary old level would be to look upon the manifestations, not the existence of man, not the existence physically, as they might say, of the nervous system, the molecular structure of the system up to the brain. Look at that as being primary level, primary purpose. But then look upon, after that, all of the manifestations, all of the goings and comings that are unique to man, the so-called cultural life, all of the institutions, all of the intellectual fantasies, dreams, and nightmares. Look at them as being, for the sake of an ad hoc exploration, look at them as being secondary. And when you see it as secondary, if you have been keeping track for the last few nights, then you also need to consider this. One of the descriptions I gave you of secondary is that the only basis that anything that is of a secondary manifestation or a secondary reality, the only basis it has for reference is self-reference. Self-reference. Now remember that. If you begin to get some intellectual hold on this over a period of time, then you can understand that a dog can never know of its dogginess. Three-dimensional intelligence cannot know itself. All of you have heard that. I even drag it up at times, the old phrase that's still kicked around and that strikes many people as being of some supreme importance. And I'm sure that there are many people that life is making say today, circa 1989, that we are really no closer in general to knowing ourselves than we were when Socrates was kicking around sitting in the gutter in Athens. And then after that, that passes for being, I assume, some sort of makeshift citywide intelligence to point out that we failed. Nobody seems inclined, seems to be driven by life, to go any further about, well, why has it not man's ability to know himself after knowing everything else in the manner in which it's increased, science? Why does man seem to be no closer to knowing himself than he was 3,000 years ago? And as I oftentimes do, I just told you. When you're dealing with secondary manifestations, its only basis for reference is self-reference. So there is no way, I start out trying to sneak up on you, there's no way a dog will ever perceive of its canineness. It's impossible. Some of you might nod immediately, well, yeah, but you don't know why you're nodding other than you think, well, a dog can't think and they don't know what a canine means anyway. But when you're operating with secondary materials operating at a secondary level, you have got the same situation when it comes to humans as you do with a dog. As a human can know all sorts of things, that is the intelligence, not the human. Let's just speak of the intelligence is what you've got to narrow your sight on. Ordinary intelligence will never know itself any more than a dog can know that it's a dog. The only basis it has for comparison is to itself. The only way that it has any meaning for a man to be America's leading food authority is on this level that is secondary and self-referring, self-serving. And if I must put it crude to remind you again, it's not an attack on this, as you should know, but it's almost compared to actually having to eat to stay alive, to being hungry and having to find food. Compared to that, for a man to be a food expert, you understand, relatively speaking, which is what the secondary level is, it's a farce. It's a sham. The only way that he is a leading expert is a bunch of people. To start with, let's say the editor of the New York Times, if that's where he is working. And I'm just arbitrarily sticking my nose into 3D reality, which we could start a number of places. Well, if we start there, he decides we need a food expert. He tells an assistant editor, find somebody. We got somebody on the paper that likes to eat, somebody that... Over a period of time, they build him up. The paper can start doing this. Watch, 2 weeks from now, they say, we're going to change your name to Baron so-and-so. He's some guy from Queens who just barely got out, make stuff out of a city college. They change his name, and since the New York Times editor can do anything he wants to with a paper, more or less, he starts saying, 2 weeks from now, leading expert will begin to write exclusively on food. So let's say he's the first food expert. The point is, you have to have a lot of humans, some humans. There has to be a kind of conspiracy, a collective conversation between more than one. One guy cannot proclaim suddenly at a secondary level, hey, I'm a world leading expert. He can, but you do understand that will not get you anywhere, well, unless you got a quarter, and then you might be to ride a bus if there's still buses for a quarter. That's where it will get you. There has to be a kind of collusion that life has got to, for some reason, need, in this case, a food expert. Nobody's ever heard of it. Let's say it's the first time. An editor, he doesn't know why. He's motivated that we need something different. We need something new and exciting in the paper. Why don't we come up with something, and he makes somebody look up, and they scratch through Greek dictionaries, and they come up with a word, or a Latin dictionary, gourmet. They say, let's call him that. We call him, oh yeah, food expert, until the people catch on. When they get tired of that, then we'll start calling him a gourmet, a professional gourmet. They have to make this up. Now, when I say collusion, of course, you understand, it's not the people, it's not the editor. It was life needs this for some reason. For nothing else, to keep the secondary level busy, to keep people staying in the slaughter queue, to keep something new going on. At any rate, the only way a man can become a food expert, the only way that anything can operate at the secondary level, is it has to be in reference to itself, or its genre. That is, it has to be in reference to other people operating at the secondary level. So, compared to people having to eat to stay alive, I am very crudely, but just to make you absolutely aware of what I'm pointing towards, and you should be able to remember this from now on, this sort of thing, relatively speaking, does no harm, it does good in life, but relatively speaking is a sham. You do surely understand, it's a farce. The only way he's a leading expert is the paper said he was. Then some other people said they was. Then he had to hire some assistants. There are people whose livelihood now depends upon the whole field of food criticism, and specifically him. But it's a kind of farce. It's like a lot of children putting on their parents' clothes and playing mother and father, and I'll come home from work. And this little, people 4 or 5 years old, the guy comes in dressed up in his father's derby and his shoes, and they play act. But as long as they play act, it's all right. Until some grown-up steps in and says, go put up your father's clothes, and plus it's time to go to bed and take off those fiddly clothes. You're nothing but children. Out in the secondary world, that does not happen on a mass level. It would be self-defeating. Life would have not started it. It happens at individual levels of people feeling as though they have been caught with their knickers down, like I've been found out, I am a fraud, this whole thing's a fraud. But at the secondary level, the only way that there is any reference point to what's going on is on the basis of self-reference, a kind of self-fueling, self-referring dance, scenario, facade, sham, structure, institution, field. But once it operates, once it's there, I will remind you, it is necessary for life. So in a sense, it is serving a primary purpose, or life would not be doing it. But to begin to see that which ordinary intelligence cannot see is to look upon the manifestations of all of this. Once it gets past, once it gets beyond the primary level of just the minimal sustaining of life, then you see these minimal, that is, these primary requirements reflected in human activities, singular human activities. Raccoons do not have raccoon food experts. They do not have newspapers. They do not have experts. They don't have Masters and Johnsons. They don't have anybody advising them on their sexual activities. It's only humans that have what I'm referring to for the time being as primary levels, primary purposes reflected, expanded into areas that are secondary. The idea that ordinary intelligence can know itself, I must tell you, I mean, it's been 3,000 years and people talking about it and dreaming about it, and there's still all kinds of mystical and spiritual and intellectual schools based upon this. The eternal struggle, we're getting closer and closer, inch by inch. They're not. At the ordinary level, none of you are any closer than you were the first time you ever heard the phrase. First time you ever run across some book or some idea of some guru that said, the thing is, you've got to find out about yourself. You've got to learn about you, and you'll learn about God. You learn about you, you'll learn about the universe. You learn about you, you'll know everything. People for thousands of years have stepped right into that. I mean, it's just a big old, in a sense, it's a nice, attractive trout, and it really has no bait at all, except for life says, come here, come here. Put your foot, that is, right in here, and people go, yes. 3D intelligence having no reference point to its activities, to its manifestations, to its dreams, to its nightmares, having no reference point, nothing stable other than the only way that the intellect, a food expert, food critic, the only way it survives, the only way that it continues to hold its job to be an intellect / food critic is other people tied up into it. Even those that don't know it, they all have a self-serving interest. They continue to respect the food critic. Some of them work for him. Some of them know that he is now evidently on good terms with the editor. Some of the other reporters used to laugh when they first heard a guy's going to write about food every day in the paper with us important people writing on politics and economics. They're going to have some guy write on food? But then they keep seeing the editor of the paper out every day eating with the guy and chatting with him. And pretty soon, those people speak very highly of the food column. Now remember, we're not talking about newspapers, we're talking about life, because everybody has a vested interest in life. You know, some Christians will badmouth Muslims, some Muslims will badmouth Jews, but when it gets down to it, you'd be surprised how liberal, how broad-minded people get when it gets down to a level, which may not happen in any particular person's lifetime, but the potential is always there. It gets down to the level that what it amounts to is you're there about to laugh at some of the other people at the water cooler and take the water cooler as being Afghanistan, take it as being Cairo, take it as being Jerusalem, New York, the water cooler. You're staying around and you're a reporter and you're about to laugh. There goes the food critic. And you're about to say, can you believe, and there comes suddenly the editor of the paper. Read God, cosmic forces, fear of the unknown on your part. But there comes the editor, he walks up to the food critic and he slaps him on the back and says, Charlie, you old son of a gun, come on, let's go have lunch. And you're about to turn to some other people at the water cooler and talk about this food critic, this other group of people, religiously, racially, sexually. And you're about to say, you know, to them, and suddenly, there comes God. Here comes forces you don't understand that slaps him on the back. And if it comes to it in a person's lifetime, it's surprising. The most conservative, narrow-minded person can suddenly see the light, at least to the point that they go, you know, having a food critic's not bad. You know, it's not bad having different religions I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm sure that deep down they're decent people. Real surprising. It used to be known as such things out in life, that there's even terms for it, that there are no atheists in a foxhole, that kind of thing. Deathbed conversions. Except you don't have to physically be dying. It's just you're staying there about to do like this, and here comes the editor, here comes the boss, slapping the guy on the back you're about to laugh at, or you find out he just married the boss's daughter. And it's surprising, just surprising how suddenly people become much more lenient. Back to what I was saying, there is no possibility of ordinary intelligence knowing itself on any basis. It will run around in circles, it will chase itself. It also turns out this kind of feeling that is not unknown, it is not untoward, it is not useless in the ordinary world, of people thriving on what seems to be the almost useless pursuit of this. That is the failure of it. To say, you know what a job this is, trying to know yourself. I've been pursuing a certain line of study from a book. I've just done this on my own since I was about 18. And here I am now, 32 years old. And sometimes I don't think I'm that much closer. You say that to somebody in a coffee shop. Another guy goes, I know what you mean. People will smile like, God, what a challenge. About the time I think I know myself, I'll do something, I'll say something, and it's obviously some dark corner, some subconscious trauma coming out. And sometimes I don't know, have I made really that much progress now in 20 some odd years? And other people will go, I know what you mean. And in a real sense, in the city, it passes for a kind of intelligence. That is, the failure, again, passes for a kind of victory of sorts. Now, couldn't that something? Worked on it for nearly 27 years. I'm not much closer than I was. What a great life. There is a reason, and I'm telling you, there is no reference point that is stable. There is no reference point that is not in some way self-serving. There is no reference point that is not some way part of that that's being attempted to be measured. That which you're trying to measure, that which you're trying to make reference to, the only way it can be measured is by its own tape. The only way it can be made, the only way you can refer to it is on the basis of self-reference. Because if it was not, there'd be no such thing as a food critic. Speaking overall, there's even a broader way, if any of you care to follow it on your own, that you could look at what people call just ordinary reality, not 3D reality. You could look at that as being, I can make it a little more specific, you could look at it as being a kind of secondary reality. In that, everything to ordinary intelligence, from scientists, psychologists, sociologists, religious leaders, etc., to ordinary people, the only thing they can make of what seems to be reality, the only thing they can make out of it, the only way they can judge it, the only way they can weigh it, the only way they can measure it, is how? On the basis of systems, measurements, decisions they have made that are all part of self-serving institutions. There's no way to come up, there's no way to formulate, to posit a new scientific theorem without it being based upon self-reference. Not that it can't be used, not that it is not pragmatic, not that it is not necessary in life, but if anybody who has a continuing idea involved with this, that there is something stable, there is something objective, there is something truly clinical, even in the scientific realm, that men can make a statement or postulate a new, almost certain theorem regarding the nature, some new corner of subatomic physics. If you take that as being some sort of stable, inalterable, in some way objective, or damn near objective rule, God, I've wasted a lot of time with you. Some of it's lots of fun to read about at times. It can be a hobby, and it is certainly useful, it is certainly necessary in life's scheme of things. But for you to think that there is something going on in any corner, in any area, that your intellect, your old intellect, considers to be the world, the real world, that something is going on out there that is not on the secondary level. Now it's going on, but you can't see it. The only thing that ordinary intelligence, the only thing that 3D intelligence can see are the manifestations, the secondary levels of whatever's going on. That's all you can see. So thus, whether it be psychology, whether it seems to be a soft science, whether it seems to be an art, a social science, whether it seems to be a hard science, whether it seems to be dream worlds, whether it seems to be common sense, none of it in a real way, in from a more complex view, has any validity except on the basis that what you are observing, you and everyone else, from an Einstein down to a drunk on the corner, the only thing you are observing are self-referring manifestations. They're all secondary. All of them. The only thing they can be compared with is themselves. So the idea that there is some objective reality out there, which is as old theoretically as the idea the unexamined life is not worth living. You should know yourself. Even the Greeks, you had guys then even theorizing that life was not made up of stable, unmoving particles like Socrates' brain and goodwill, or this rock, that there were little atoms in there. They were already using the term. They have been discussing, philosophers and scientists, all the way from them, what would appear to be interest in the world out there as opposed to in here. In other words, another version of know thyself being of great importance. Another one is we should have objective knowledge of the world out here. But the majority at any given time, or at least the recognized thinkers in life's history at any given time, would say that we have something less than an objective knowledge. Many of the philosophers and some of the scientists of a philosophical bent even today will say we're not even sure anymore that it's possible to have an objective view of the world, because as it sprang, as they credit now with the advent of quantum mechanics, of getting down in the mechanics itself of trying to see smaller and smaller, that the machinery, the technology of trying to see that small interfered with that which was attempting to be seen. But I've been through this once with some of you. If you don't recall, I pointed out or tried to get you to consider it's not the technology at fault. Now what they're saying is true enough. You can understand that. You start getting down and you run across all sorts of things in the 3D world, microscopes of trying to get down to what is the shortest wavelength that is visible. No matter how we do it technologically, the human eye. And they get down even beyond electron microscopes. And they bring something. They computerize the image that nobody's ever seen before. It's still, for you to see it, for the computer to take this, for them to be able to begin to measure through light and other ways down at the atomic level, and then to present a picture of it, still you're left with this of what it is, 1/4 of a millionth of a meter. Is the human eye cannot see a wavelength past that. So it just disappears. It's not there. So the idea that there is some form of reality, there's some basis somewhere, and we may never see it because of the kind of displacement that technology brings about, it's not simply that, it's this. Back to, that was sort of a sidestep, but back to the idea that man has had and is continuing to have a problem actually defining a stable, objective definition of out there. It's the same thing as me telling you there's no possible way for a secondary system to know itself, because the only point of reference it has is itself. It's the same out here. The idea they're expressing about knowing it in a valid way to say, well, we do not have an objective view of reality. Many philosophers have said that, and then they go into, long before quantum mechanics, go into, well, everybody's prejudiced and everybody's own makeup of their brain, their own opinions interfere, so it would be very difficult, they were saying this thousands of years ago, to get an objective view of reality. Not difficult. Don't worry about them saying we may not be much closer. That's true, we're not much closer. Not ordinary intelligence. Because they can no more define objectively what they mean by that. Out there, no one can. A scientist, psychologist, common sense can no more define an objective out there than it can say, I objectively know me. I know me. I mean, nothing else, but now I've studied me for 50 or 60 years. I know what I am. Balderdash. You may know that you're a food critic. You may know your name. You may know that, boy, I have a bad temper. I know that I've cheated people. I know people's cheated me. I know that some people don't like me. You may know all that. In the same way that you may know, well, that's down, that's up, and that's hot, and this is cold over here. But the difficulty that ordinary intelligence senses and then talks about, the difficulty of defining, establishing an objective view of reality, is simply that there is none possible for 3D intelligence. Because no matter what it defines, no matter if it says, well, we're getting closer, we're getting further away, it doesn't matter. No matter what it defines, no matter what it says is stable, here is a theory that has held up for X number of years, X number of hundreds of years. It does not matter. It is not a, quote, objective view, because its only point of reference is itself. whatever the hell this is could be thought of in a particular way in regards to this kind of, in this general area in which I was trying to drag you some more tonight. This could be looked at all the time, up until today, as being a kind of attempt individually to create a new higher floor of a primary level of reality, individually. And it has to do, I'll see if I can drag you toward that in a few minutes, to do with that kind of progression also. It's in line with that progression from the simplistic to the complex to the grotesque to Boomsville, to great alterations or dismantling of whatever it was. But this kind of activity on an individual level can be seen in a certain way as being the attempt of the individual to create a new higher within floor, but a new higher and then the floor of another or a higher primary level of reality. Or sometime in the past, if you recall, I either said or had Kairut mention that this kind of activity can be seen as a form or a kind of enriched simplicity. It could be seen as a kind of personalized higher form of, okay, I'll say it, simplistic complexity. I'm not saying it just to sound zen or obnoxious. Ordinary intellect has dreamed and talked about the edges of what I'm talking about right now for a long time. As witness, perhaps the easiest to describe or to refresh your memories, your past reading, the idea that if man, those attracted to mystical quest and all that balderdash, that if they do get somewhere, those that did get somewhere and some way got in touch with, in line with great cosmic forces or got in tune with the guides, they in some way became, and this is common, it gets translated even from other languages into English, they became more simplistic. The whole idea of saints, holy men, nice smiling little boogers just standing there that they don't seem to want anything, they don't want to take your woman, they don't want to pick your pocket, they don't want to convince you of anything. They just seem, I don't know, more, don't mean it offensive, I don't guess, but they just seem sort of simple in a holy, in an admirable way. It is a kind of simplicity, but it's not a retreat. And those that this happens in life, it's going on now, apparently sort of simple, direct, noble savage gurus, if that indeed is all they are, it is a retreat. There's nothing there. You can't learn anything. You cannot create any new intelligence for yourself if that's what you're interested in. But it is a kind of crude reflection. It is a more simplistic version of what I'm describing, because whatever the hell this is, does not just push. You cannot be totally immune from or escape from that kind of progression I have pointed out. And I'm going to try to get into a bit more of things going from some arbitrary point that I jump in. Out here in the world, secondary activities. Look at them, which remember secondary activities are always relative. They're always only comparable to themselves in some way. So we start out and say, all right, right here it's sort of simplistic. It's simplistic compared to what it's going to be if it lives. So it's simplistic, then it gets complex, then it becomes grotesque, and then it blows up. And it gets rearranged. It comes back anew in some other slightly altered form at least, or else it just, boom, go live with the dinosaurs. Even in this, you're not immune from that, and so it does not go. Your intelligence, or whatever you think that you've gotten from this thus far, it's not a matter that you start out sort of simple, and by getting involved with me, I got you more and more complex, and now you think about things you'd never thought about. If that's all it was, you would eventually, if you pushed on far enough, you would not be immune from it running the grave possibility of you becoming grotesque. That is, becoming almost a parody, which this happens. And I've had to run people away from here, and usually they sort of get overripe, and it's like rotten fruit, and they just fall off by themselves. But they begin to get sort of grotesque about, boy, I know so much now. You know, I know so much shit from hanging around you that it's just frightening. When it gets to that point, it is kind of frightening. Because you have not reached escape velocity from that ordinary progression of simplistic into more complex, into grotesque, into Shazam, boom. Because it is not to simply make you more and more complex. That's what I was sort of hinting, rather than going to try and draw out in any vivid, bold colors necessarily. It's what this kind of idea of simplistic saints and holy men, the idea that they're in some way more simplistic, that they do not have ulterior motives. The reality of that is that this could be seen as the individual attempt. I say attempt, where I'm sort of hinting that what I'm about to describe in the rest of the sentence is some degree of success, to use a figure of speech, as you begin to establish a new floor of a kind of enriched simplicity, that you're past the grotesque, you're certainly past the complex. I have described it, of course, many times on a more, apparently, strictly physical molecular basis of the brain itself, literally. That you begin to activate and use parts of the brain that are simply not being used, that life does not require of man right now. But it's like you get a view of what's going on. It is the more complex view, term I use. You begin to see that, and whatever that means. I won't go into it tonight, I won't even talk, but my inference is that you begin to see things that are so complex, so meaty, so weighty, so obtuse, so oblique, so cloudy, so opaque to humanity, to philosophers, to scientists, and even to great people like yourself. And then one day you see it and you go, my inference being, I don't want to come out and say it, but my inference being that that which was very simple, very complex, almost to the point of being grotesque and deranged, you'll see it and it's kind of like, do I have to say the word? It's like you've established a new level. It's not that you regressed. You didn't go backwards and think, well, this started out as a simple idea. And then somewhere humanity, varying cultures, the stupidity of life itself, muddied this all up. But I in some way will become an intellectual Rousseau, and I'll retreat back into some kind of previous noble, savage, intellectual state, and this will all be simple again. That's suicide, if you could do it. It's not that. You have taken the progression of the simple to the more complex to another level that I'm just going to call it another level of simplistic. But it's not a retreat. It's not like where you started. It's up on another level that, it's like adding another dimension, or being able to see in 4 dimensions all the time. And the first time you see it, it's like the most complex thing in the world for a second. Like, my God, I'm having some kind of psychedelic mushroom flashback. Then you realize, no, I'm not. It's just I'm hanging around him. I don't take drugs anymore. And then, just a split second after that, is what I'm trying to say without saying the S word, is all of this, let's say one area at least, something that was very complex and that you thought nobody understands. My mother, my father, the Pope, nobody, and suddenly you go, But it's not of backing up. It's not a retreat. You've gone to another level, and it's like now, that kind of astounding, almost disorienting for a second, seeing, let's say, in 4 dimensions, that you just see, Right after that, it is then simple. That a whole lot of things that seem to be incomplete, indescribable, inexplicable, are suddenly explicable. Simply because you see, well, that's kind of, It's like a new level, a new floor of an enriched simplicity. As opposed to, maybe I should carry it this way, as opposed to, look at life, look at the ordinary life of people. That progression that I was speaking of in a little more specific sense last time, of the simplistic into the complex, into the grotesque, and then a kind of, if a thing survives long enough, it will go past grotesque into a kind of explosion. into a critical period wherein the thing will either die, disappear, get dismantled, just kind of go away like the dinosaurs, like certain theories that men have had throughout the ages about this and that. Or, if you can spot it, if you could see in 4 dimensions, you may see that it does come back, like the phoenix, like seeds blown to the wind. This strange tree that everybody thought was dead, suddenly they find it somewhere else, that it seems to have come back in a slightly or even a drastically altered version. All right? Back referring to that, there's a way in which you can see the actual life, the 60 or 70 years of an ordinary person in that same progression. But instead of me saying from the simplistic to the complex to the grotesque and then to the explosion, look at it as being the process of birth, maturity, senility, and then death. That is the same, it is a parallel description, and a valid one, to the simplistic, or mind of the simplistic dash growth, dash grotesque, dash explosion, slash rebirth, slash disappearance. With ordinary people, you should be able to see that. At birth, and then for a while, whatever maturity is, there's no sense in me trying to make any absolute chronological cutoff line, but from birth up to the time you're mature, in a gradual process, you could look at things and the person, the child, you or any child you're observing, as being pretty what? Simple. It takes no great persuasive effort on my part to get you to see that a child is pretty simple about everything it does, about everything at the primary level, which for a while is the only level in which it operates. When it's hungry, it screams, it cries. If it gets smart enough, it points at its mouth or it points at food. Hot, cold, everything is very direct, everything is very simple. Maturity could be seen as, in my parallel process, could be seen as reaching the complex. And you reach it and it's almost the world's thinnest blade, because you reach it and that's it. As witnessed by the fact in the streets and the farms, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You get complex, you become mature, and that's about as complex as ordinary people are ever going to get. After that, you begin to rot, in a sense. That is, you begin to go from complex, nothing untoward, nothing's a muck here, it's just the way things are. You begin, in a sense, to go downhill. You begin to rot. That is, the complexity begins to turn into a kind of grotesqueness. And when I said senility, I didn't mean in some physiological, clinical sense of me trying to define, because everybody does not get senile, as they call it now, is using it as a shorthand. It is the continuing, inescapable, at the ordinary level, deterioration of the human. Physically, without any doubt, hate to tell some of you that, intellectually, and there's no real word, let me call it sensually. By that I don't mean the erotic life of man, but I mean your interest, outside of simply staying alive and warm, but your interest, your hobbies, the things that you do on the secondary level that are unique to humans. All of that begins to rot. You begin to, not only your body begins to deteriorate, your strength, your muscle tone, all that just begins to go. Intellectually, people begin to go. Talking about ordinary people, all of you know that, and it's not necessary that everybody becomes senile to the point that they get up every morning and have to be reminded who they are. It's just that the intellect, people forget. The intellect begins to rot and die like the rest of the body. But then is that area that is the direct participation at the secondary level of a man's hobbies. The things that interest him, whether it was pornography or water skiing. He starts going downhill, less and less interest. The sensual life, that which seems to tie him to some kind of interest that makes hanging around here in the slaughter queue bearable, the older people get, the more it's just like, don't bother me. Old grandfather, whatever happened to your stamp collection? It used to, when I'd come up here once a year, you'd always show me your stamp collection. Your grandfather would go, stamp collection. Hell, I threw them things away. Yeah, but you loved them. Fuck it, I ain't got time for that stuff. What else he got but time? You're just sitting around staring at his knees all day, but That is what I meant by, I was calling it senility, just as a shortcut, shorthand word, but that is reaching the area that I was giving you in the parallel process of grotesque. So when it does reach, which is not uncommon in life, that kind of level of an extreme out in life, people you know, could have been somebody related to you, they almost become a parody of themselves. They just simply do. They reach a point, and it's almost your grandfather, some guy down the street you know that you always looked up to. I'm not trying to give you the blues, but people, when it reaches a certain level, they can almost become a sad parody of what they were in younger days, back when they were complex, not grotesque. This is an observable flow in the city. There's no question about it, even with ordinary intelligence, of this happening physically. Ordinary intelligence in the city would probably give me more of an argument when I started talking about intellectually, by saying, well, of course there are people around who strive, life makes them strive to stay healthier intellectually, in the same way that life makes some people, when they're 9 years old, still out jogging. And they're the ones that say, I wouldn't be 90 if I didn't get and jog every day, which shows how much they know, because at any rate, some of you are ready to figure that out. And so there are people in the city who, at later ages, go back to college and take up learning to speak BC Greek at the age of 90. And so they're the ones who would say, hey, they'd tell me, you're wrong about people intellectually going down, look at me. Of course, they don't see the justice in that. They don't understand that, yeah, right. At any rate, I would get even less argument, but I'd probably get incomprehension from most ordinary level intelligence when I was talking about the sensual side. Some of you understand what I mean. That is, that which just seems to tie you in some electrical, some stimulating, some provocative connection to life itself, even if you're 70 or 80 or 90, other than the fact that you get up every day and you gum a little oatmeal and then stare at your knees all day and you go to bed. And that's not just, it's not just, well, you're getting old. Or the person says, I'm getting old and I can't do any better. I just want you to see that it's as though you become slowly unplugged from the main generator, the main flow of energy of life, and you do, in a sense, become grotesque. I got to turn the tape over. I left off still using the word grotesque. Although this kind of activity is not to make you a neater old man or a cooler old woman, assuming you live long enough to be referred to as an old man or old woman. That's not the purpose, but you surely realize that at an individual level of your own thinking, of your own living within your own nervous system, this kind of activity has got to be a straying from that normal flow. That is, of you becoming so complex that you begin to rot like everybody's supposed to. And once you can begin to get yourself above that level, in a sense, you can just let it go, because it's going to do what it was going to do anyway. But you cannot be a part of that kind of very mechanical, that inescapable flow of you becoming complex to the point of being mature, and that's it. And then you begin to die. You begin to turn into a grotesque version of whatever you were, whatever position you were playing in the last little game. You cannot do that. And of course, on the other hand, I'm inferring, rather than saying you can't do it, I'm inferring that if you can get above your own predictable activated level in the brain, that you got some hope for that not happening, or some of you needing hope for that not happening. There's another aspect that I want to mention. There are many myths, religious or otherwise. They're all myths, but they reflect something. Not culturally, not psychologically, not subconsciously. It's life having information at a primary level that seeps out. It is like four-dimensional information. and it comes through, but when it gets into ordinary intelligence, all you can come out with is a 3D version of it. And so therefore it's always a little, instead of saying flawed or lacking, let me just say it's always a little, to those who are interested in such things, spooky, weird. And so it turns into gods, and even those who are not all that religiously wired up, then they say, well, this may not literally be about gods, but let's study some of these old myths, because I think that it is some kind of reflection of man's unconsciousness. All over the world, all throughout time, have been myths of this sort. And all of you have read them. I bet you never had occasion to put them, or to see what a large family of which they were a part. The myths are about a people somewhere raise up a leader, which is another story I perhaps we'll get into some night. It's not normally looked that way in history. In history it's always looked at, or normally looked at, that some guy comes along and takes charge. Right? I mean, that's the way it appears, that suddenly people are standing around the steps, around the black, standing around Eastern Europe, and they look off, several of them, they say, God almighty, look out there, I think, here comes, is that guy we heard about, him and all of his Huns? And suddenly Attila shows up and just, stomps everybody and takes over. That's the way history sees all of this, that suddenly a guy takes over. I'm not going into it tonight. It is not quite that simple. Some of the myths, follow me, the people raise up a leader. It's not just that a leader, a dominant figure, comes up to this group of people, this tribe, this nation, and says, all right, mothers, get up, we're going to dance. It's not that simple. I know I've used that example more than, because everybody is part of the submissive part. I don't see any Attilas in here, or any Hitlers, or Castros. But to say that that is the only view of it, if that's what you think, you're mistaken. Because in a sense, the people, some group of people, some nation, some tribe, some whole group here, the majority, to say the least, if it's 10,000 of them, all but one or two of them are wired up to dance backwards. And they know it. They never heard that term. But when they start thinking, all right, we're getting so large, we need a leader. We're getting so complex here. And we've been a little nation here. We're all intermarried and we're separate. We're slightly different hair color than these people over in the other caves. We need to band together. We're all more or less related. Yeah. What we need's, and they didn't have the word, so somebody makes up the word, a leader. And they said, that's it. And the people know that if that group is going to survive as a describable, identifiable group, somewhere in there is going to be somebody whose molecular structure is such that even though they didn't have the word then, they're going to be charismatic. Natural leader. As soon as they think, if this group of people is going to survive as an identifiable group of people, as soon as they think that, as soon as life makes them think that, and as soon as they think, what we need is somebody to lead us, because we can't go around, there's all kinds of political excuses and explanations of this even today, that all of us, we're free men and free women, even though we're cave people, and we're all intelligent, yeah, we all know what we're doing, but we can't operate as some mad mob now. There's almost 10,000 of us. We need one guy to run it. Out of 10,000, there won't be any secret if it's going to survive. It'll immediately, almost all of them will go. Gork, Fred. Where'd Abe go? Get him. They just know. And he may say, hey, I don't do this. I got to look after my family. So it's not simply, I'm getting off where I was going with this, but I wanted you to hear what I was saying. I'm just not flippantly saying that people raise up a leader. It is equally as valid to say that 9,999 people go over to Gorg or Fred or Abe, and they say, let's dance. And he goes, oh, come on. No. In other words, they're saying, we made you leader. He goes, no. And I'm not just talking about some kind of sham humility of a guy who's really an undercover Mussolini and he's trying to play coy. That he's always wanted to be a dictator and he's going to make them say, beg me. It's not that. There's an equally valid understanding and description that the people, anyway, we'll go into that some other time perhaps, because there's a real something there that nobody has ever seen in life. Of course, what else is new? Does that ever strike you that I never tell you things anybody's ever seen? So how can you ever tell whether the end of this is valid? Talk about self-reference. I have taken the whole thing of self-reference to an extreme that nobody ever imagined, because none of this is true by anybody's definition. Except I start off with things that sound all right, that sound like you might be interested, like, well, how does a group of people end up with a leader? And then I tell you things, but now, of course, some of you are so hoodwinked by me that you go right along that this almost makes sense. But if you try to, fold this up and fly it outside on the street, suddenly known laws of 3D physics will take this little paper plane and they'll go and explode. At any rate, back to it. Not just the literal, what I'm describing, which is true, that we'll get into perhaps some other time, of what I'm describing about a group of people raising up a leader. Let's go back to the myths. They're everywhere, from your religions to myths themselves throughout the world. There are no exceptions. I know myths all over the world of the same kind, and it's this, that the people raise up a leader. And by raise up, what I really mean is they respect him. They pay homage. It's not a dictatorship. Even historically, the myth may present him as such, that he killed people. Seemed like he was a real sorehead. But when I say the people raised him, what I mean is, even the myth says that although he went around and would get drunk and kill people and send down thunderbolts, or somebody just look at him wrong when he was drunk and he'd kill them, the people loved the bastard. Remember that. That's what I mean by they raised him up. As he apparently was half the time deranged, but whatever it was, they raised him up. He was theirs. Then in a sense, the myth, they fattened him up. That is, they really began to adore him. He goes from being simplistic to being more complex. Then the myths get into an area that nobody can make any sense out of. It goes from, when it hits this place, it turns into things you wouldn't believe. Of course you will believe them, because I guess I'll go ahead and point out some of them become the linchpin in religions. I'm talking about major religions. They fatten him up and then they kill him. But they kill him on the basis that it's a sacrifice for a new leader, somebody that's better. Now, it's not necessarily described this way, but what they're doing is replaying these myths, what I'm describing to you, of simplistic, complex, grotesque, and explosion. But what they can't make out of it, even the myths, and it happens in real life, which like I said, I don't think I'm going to go into other than I have already. The myths, the people kill the leader they raised up. They sacrifice him, and then it takes a great jump in many instances. It's not a sacrifice for a new leader. Then it's a sacrifice, they believe, that when I say that it reached the point that it blew up and disappeared, or else get altered drastically, and Phoenix like arises, is what? The guy they killed comes back to life, which is a dead end. And it becomes a religion, or it becomes the focal point. It becomes the raison d'etre of the religion itself, that if our leader did not prove that he could be killed, like we're all going to be killed, and everybody goes, yeah, we're all going to die, but he came back after we killed him, or well, after they killed him. No, not us, but after they killed him, he came back. That's a version of the myth. I'm suggesting to you that that's not even the most efficient. I'm also suggesting to you that there is another kind of knowledge of the myth that is never put in words, is why I said that it's never been looked at this way. That it is a sacrifice of that which became too complex, and the people kill him, or banish him, which is the same thing. They banish their god, or this leader, but normally they kill him in some way. But it's always on the basis that they've got another one stashed, for his son. The old leader, the one that they raised up, they fattened, they revered, they made him what he is, by their love of him, by their worship, by their feeding. He didn't have to do anything. But then he reached the point that he was becoming grotesque. He was getting senile. He could no longer make 15 wives happy. He was no longer the living embodiment of them. He now became a caricature of what he was. He became a caricature of what a leader should be, and the people kill him. But as soon as they kill him, he didn't know it, or maybe he caught a glimpse just as he was bringing his last breath. Here is his 15-year-old son. They're on the slide. They've been teaching him to be king. And as soon as they kill him and burn him or whatever it is, drive a stake through his neck, just as he's dying, here comes his 17-year-old son, and they whip the crown off and hand it to him. All over the world are these stories. As I said, you don't have to just look for myths. They're right at the heart of most of the major religions, some version of this, a cruder version. That which seems to be the leadership, that which seems to be the brains of a group of people, goes through the process. Starts out simple, that he is charismatically, he is molecularly, he is electrically and chemically destined to be the brains of this group of people. Their brains, he's the most talented, he can fuck longer than anybody else, he can keep more women happy, he turns out more progenies than anybody else. He is the living embodiment of the people, and they love him. Till he gets complex and he starts becoming grotesque. His sexual powers begin to fail. His intellectual powers begin to fail. He can no longer wrestle on St. Quantum's Day. He cannot drink like he used to. He cannot scare everybody like he used to. Oh, they'll put up with it. But it becomes time to kill him, to sacrifice him. But it's always on the basis that Phoenix-like, somebody will arise. He will be replaced. The crude version says he replaces himself, which goes nowhere. That becomes religion, becomes a dead-end street. Because then everybody sits around, because nobody ever, actually, those who saw him were always few in number, and they're gone. And so everybody else is left waiting. Dun, 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 dun. He did it once, so he'll do it again. The real version, that is the uncertain, the enigmatic, the uncertain version, which is life itself, is that each time the people kill their brains, their leader, they replace him, not with the same guy, but a new one. Many times it's his son, his brother, no problem with that, but not him. They kill him, that's it. He reached the end of that line of progression. Not only did he become complex, he became grotesque. He's not our brains anymore. He is not the embodiment of us. I wish, as much as I like this, I wish that had some possible significance to people individually. But I've thought as I stood here, and I just can see none, so I guess we'll just drop it. I heard another good one. You remember the night before last, and the night, 2 nights or 3 nights before that, I was mentioning to you life not being certain. And I was using an example 2 nights ago of pornography. But how constantly, anything that's alive, anything that is a continuing process and activity in life's body, in the life of man, some segment of people are going to find favor with it, and some other segment are going to denounce it. Let's go back to that for a few minutes. In my ever active quest to stay abreast of world affairs, I heard recently a comment that went thusly: that after 40 years of success, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, seemed now to be in danger of, or its own downfall seemed to be perhaps imminent, but based upon the 40 years of its success. Oh, it makes sense if you didn't already figure it out. What they're saying is now that the new generation in Europe that did not experience the big war, that grew up in peace, forget their so-called tensions, but they have not seen war. They certainly not saw World War II, which NATO was supposed to protect the succeeding generations, hold the possible negative aftermath of World War II, protect everybody's position, protect the Germans and the Poles and everybody from the Russians. All right, now you got a whole new generation of Poles and Russians and Czechs, that they got their own problems with their leaders, their neighbors. And to say we got to protect you from Russia or the United States, the new generation goes, what? I've never seen them hurt us. So, the commentator was saying that NATO his downfall may be upon us. That is, the new generation, they do not want to pay the taxes. They're out demonstrating, telling the United States, get your planes out of England. Get them out of West Germany. You've got them out now demonstrating in East Germany, telling the Russians, pull your troops out of here. Don't fool with us. But then you have the older generation, they're still around. They're going, Jesus, holy mother of Christ, you kids are idiots, you're fools. If it had not been for NATO, or from the other view, it's the Warsaw Pact. But let's take the Western view. The guys who survived it, they're saying, you people are idiots. We've got to keep NATO. We've got to have this protection. They say, why? They say, well, the reason that you've never known war, the reason you can say why, is because it was here to protect us. And the people who've had no direct experience with it, they go, you bunch of old farts. You're wasting our money, our tax money. You're just, trying to play boogeyman and scare us. That doesn't mean anything. The Russians have never hurt me. They've never attacked us. The Americans never done anything but come over here and take up a bunch of our land for these bases, and they fly too low overhead, and they get drunk and try to pick up our women. Get them out of here. All right. There's several aspects that are tied directly with what I've been talking to from that example. One is, and I'm more or less quoting what the guy said, that NATO's downfall may come about because of 40 years of success. Now you do follow now what I'm saying, what the guy thought he was saying, that NATO has been so successful at keeping the peace that now the generation that has known nothing but peace, thanks to NATO, now say, what the hell do we need this for? So its very success could prove to be its downfall. All right, that's one aspect. It was only 2 nights, 48 hours ago. I was giving my example. I'm sure some of you saw, but now I'm trying to expand it and connect it up with some more of the corners I've been trying to sketch. You can look at it in a certain way in the 3D world of success equaling a kind of dismantling. Yeah. That is, success, if it becomes total, that is, let's assume that NATO has such an effect that keeps the peace a little bit longer. Maybe it'll take another generation, maybe not. And you got nobody that was alive during World War II. And so the people that look around now that want to protest or want to say, get the tanks out of here, get these foreigners off our soil, they wait, and there's no person to holler, oh, you should have been here back in the 1940s when the Russians were about to kill us. No, there's nobody left. They think, why do we have these bases here? Why do we have this thing NATO? And they look around and there's nobody to tell them why. Oh, of course there will be somebody say, wait a minute, we have got to look to history. I'm getting to the other aspect I wanted to point out. Not only can apparent success equal a kind of destruction of something, a kind of dismantling, if it appears to be real success in the 3D world. Now I'm trying to give you a slightly different view that some of you gave a hearty laugh when I was pointing out that life is totally, there is never totally certain of anything as long as it is alive, and when it becomes totally certain, which is a crude way of trying to describe the 3D world, but when it's absolutely certain of anything, the thing tends to disappear. That is, life tends to no longer need it is the only reason it becomes absolutely sure of it, hence the demise of dinosaurs. In this case, it may be the demise of NATO. NATO may go live with the dinosaurs and Elvis. It may just go. Why? Because life, or they're saying, because of its success, which is a good way of putting it if they understood the further ramifications. I'm saying life finally decides in this one instant, well, of course this entails a lot, I know, but I'm just going to say right quick that life decides that those parts of my body known as Russia, Europe, and the United States over here, maybe it rubs some salve on itself, maybe it got a heating pad, this decide I'm all right there. That may be the end of it. In other words, it doesn't need any NATO. NATO may be like a little mentholatum that rubbed on itself for a while, and it rubs it off, and so NATO goes away. The tension between certain molecular structures known as the USSR and the United States, and then the middle ground of Europe being used where all these molecules and anti-molecules fight it out. I often go, oh, could be that. The thing is, to say that something, that the success of something was its own downfall is correct. In the 3D world, it makes no sense. They can't go any further with it. The commentator made the news with it. Nobody stood up and said it's insane. They could hear what he was saying. That's because that NATO has been successful is find the new generation. That is, it's kept the new generation from the ravages and the terrors of war, but they don't know that. And so they're saying, where are the ravages and terrors of war? You know, you're just trying to scare us. We don't need this protection. When it's the protection that kept them from it. Oh, these children. You know, people that's never experienced this. Success. That is, life totally deciding anything. You're asking for a dismantling of it. Again, I'm glad. Well, I can't say I'm glad. I tried to think of some possible personal significance that you might use of that, but again, I don't know any. I just wanted to bring it up. Another aspect of this. Right quick in your own nervous system, you should be able to feel this. You should be able to feel it, although I don't guess any of you went through World War II, and damn few of you went through any kind of war. But you should be able to feel this somewhere. The generation, let us say some people staying now in France or Belgium or Germany, old enough that they actually were in World War II, and they've got these kids out here, maybe their own children, marching in the streets saying, get NATO out of here. Get these foreign troops off our soil. And they're out there sweating blood, screaming. And this guy that went through it, maybe he goes out, maybe he's a chancellor of a university, some respected figure, and he says, you people, you don't understand. You don't know what we went through so that you could have the freedom to come out here. We can't just dismantle all of our defensive mechanisms. We can't send these other troops, the United States or whoever it is, home. You got no idea. Don't you read your history books? And let us say if they are college students, and they did read their history books. All right? As much of a great purpose as you should be able to easily see now when you think about it, that memory serves. It is refried, repackaged, frozen energy. There are still things that memory cannot do. Cannot do. And from a certain view, if you can see this, it's going to get, all right, I'll say it's sticky here for a second. But it's a good thing it can't. Well, obviously knows what it's doing. There reaches a level wherein energy memory cannot convey energy past a certain point. To wit, scenario I'm making up. The chancellor comes out and he berates. He tries to shame these students. And let's say that one or two of them, let's pick out one, goes back and he begins to read history. He finds a good illustrated history of World War II. And it's got blood and guts and horrible pictures and detailed descriptions from people's diaries of what they went through. Now a person can read that. Or he can have the chancellor or a speaker, his father, tell him how horrible it was, what happened. And his son sits there and he says, I want to understand. I want to listen. And he'll listen. He'll ask questions. And the father, through memory, tries to convey the horrors of such war. There are certain things that memory cannot do. Cannot do. No history, no retelling of war, for instance, will ever be able to begin to produce the kind of terror that the actual presence of the war produced in the people. It ends up, and it's not just warfare, as you should know, I'm just picking out an example. It ends up apparently being this not only wide, but once it is seen, it is so narrow, it is so necessary, but it's known as this gap between generations. And it's not simply some kind of gap culturally, chronologically between generations. It is based upon what I'm saying you is the energy conveying limits of memory. That one generation, this father, let's say the father and son are that close, and the son begins to ask, what is NATO? Tell me about World War II, Dad. Weren't you there? You never talk about it. So he decided, I'll sit down and tell you everything that happened. And the son sits there, I want to hear about it. Tell me. And the father tries his best to tell him. He will never be able to convey, and it could appear to be, and is oftentimes described, is the most common description, there's some kind of cultural, generational gulf that the father can't really instill in the son what happened. There's a reason though. There's a kind of built-in protection, memory between people, history, whether it be from just one generation or it's whether you're trying to read back and you get the glorious book you can on the Crusades or the Inquisition, and you say, I'm going to try and relive. I can't understand how the church, how religion could have run amok in such a way. Maybe if I read everything I get my hands on and try to immerse my intelligence and my feelings into it, I'll get some grasp on what happened. You may read it and get a chill on some bloody description they give. But there is no way that anybody, whether it be across a period of 500 years or a period of 20 years, there's a limit that history, that is memory, there is a limit to the energy, the effect, the apparent touching of one human nervous system. There is a distinct limit to this. Not only is it possible, to go back to my example, that the success of NATO, as they were putting it, may be its downfall, it can't be otherwise. Once something, whether it be NATO, whether it be an idea, whether it be a cultural norm, once it has reached the point that it apparently has succeeded to such a degree that a new generation comes by and they can understand why we have this structure, why we have this institution, because it is apparently protecting us from something that we have never been subject to. And the other generation says, yeah, but the reason we haven't been subject to it is because we did that. And the other generation goes, what? And he says, don't you understand things? So, well, yeah, it makes sense verbally, but... And that's the end of it. Oh, for the third time, I tried so hard to think of some way this might be pertinent to a person's individual thinking process or your life. And I just can't come up with anything. I don't see how this could possibly be pertinent to an individual life of a person. I just can't. I just thought it was kind of psychologically interesting or sociologically or anthropologically fat chance. How much time we got? Something else about primary and secondary levels and purposes. Since I was talking about armed conflicts, before I leave that completely, let me say it one more time. There are limits, absolute limits, and it connects with all sorts of things, not only the generational gap, but apparently the failure of communication between peoples. Of somebody saying, let me tell you what's happened to me in my life. Let me tell you why I am like I am. I had such a trauma in my childhood. My house burned down when I was 7 years old. I stood there and watched my mother and father and 2 younger brothers burned to death. They couldn't get to them. I saw that in person. And you wonder why I drink. You wonder why I'm upset. Can you imagine what that is? And let's say he's talking to his new girlfriend or his wife or his best friend. And the person will go, God, that's horrible. He said, I'm telling you, I can hear them scream sometimes at night. I can hear my own mother scream, and people go, God, that's horrible. But there is no way to convey the energy by a telling, by a memory, by a history, from one molecular structure, known as a person, to another that will match the experience. And people think, well, nobody cares about me. You don't care. I try to tell you, and you just treat me. I tried to tell you about my mother and father burning up. Yeah, I hadn't forgotten it. Well, how can you treat me this way? When I get a little upset, you must remember that's what made me do it. Well, I know it's horrible, but I forgot. I don't know, I got carried. It's not forgot. It's not failure to communicate. It's not a generational gap. There's a limit. Memory is to recall energy, to recycle it, to reuse it. But nothing. Once you take the water out of orange juice, it never tastes like orange juice again. Not like it did originally. Anything you can recover is never as good as the first act, the first version. It cannot come back. There's no way that one person can communicate. That is, to take the energy that was inherent in some experience and hand it to another person. It cannot be done. And the reality of this is all around you, and it is observed, it is noted, in more simplistic ways, more three-dimensional ways, and I just gave you several examples of such things as failure to communicate, the inability of people to feel sympathy or empathy for another person, the inability for people to learn from history, or the gap between generations. I'm telling you, there is a molecular, there is a kind of valve, there is a kind of fuse in the flow of energy through man, a kind of limit that is built into how much energy, how much passion you can convey to any other person whether it be something that happened 5 minutes ago, 10 years ago, or whether it's you now trying to read history and trying to in some way feel what it must have been like to be put on the rack, to be hounded by Cardinal Fang. You can try. As I said, you may get the cold chills. You may go, ooh, that's horrible. But it is not the experience itself. The success, the things that remain, by the way, also, I was pointing out this thing about the success may be something's downfall, and me saying when life is totally convinced one way or the other. You know, it is looking back on the panorama of history, not in books, but in your own nervous system, if you can see this. It is only the relics of failure that remain for the tourists to wander in. That's it. That's all you find. You don't find the success. The relics of history. Whether we're talking about who knows what I'm talking about now. Whether, if in fact I might be talking about the Colosseum, fragments of some religion that we only got 2 or 3 pages of, that found in some cave in Syria. The relics that are left are artifacts of failure. The rest of it, life does away with. That's why they can't find dinosaur bones. Well, they find a few here and there, but they cannot find the relics of dinosaurs. Well, you take it from there. History only keeps the relics that humans can find of failure. What I was going to end with, I was going to tell you while I was talking about wars and etc. That connected to primary and secondary purposes. Can you feel this? Can you think about it that you already had this kind of information from your own reading, but it's in your nervous system? Men, ordinary intelligence, have opinions that differ. They think in a certain way about 2 different kinds of warfare. This has never been said, it's never been looked at this way, but history, that is, human intelligence, looks upon certain kinds of wars as being almost understandable. Let's just take history so that you can, for a second, believe that you're far removed from it. When it seemed to be wars, thousands of years ago, or at least hundreds of years ago, that the wars seemed to have been fought on the basis of primary needs, food, the ability for the group of people to sustain themselves, the need for shelter, of water. Men, history, has one opinion. They think, they describe those kind of wars a certain way. They have another thinking of wars, of course they don't use my terms, but they were fought apparently for secondary reasons. That is, over ideas, political theories, religious notions. A large part of life's nervous system, men, now look back, read about such things, and there is an effluvium, a kind of almost, if there was such a thing, they'd probably say there is, intellectual moral outrage that groups of people fall over something like one group says, our God's named Fred. Another one says, no, that's the wrong God. We've heard of him. The real God is named Abe. And they fought. They killed young men. They burned down villages. It's like, what stupidity. And of course it's going on today that apparently groups of people are fighting over ideas. But historically, men who read back that one group attacked another because their people were starving. And they looked across the river here and these other people had a whole bunch of food. And they went over and they started a fight. Maybe they said, give us half your food. We're starving. They said, no, we won't. And they said, well, we're going to have to fight you for it. It's like something in the human nervous system, the same kind of people be outraged over religions fighting, or over just ideologies being apparently the basis for warfare, which is not, but apparently being that way. They do not feel that same kind of outrage if they think, if history, the recollection of the human nervous system, seems to be that this particular war may have been just as bloody, took just as many lives, but it was this one group literally fighting for their existence. They had to have food. They were starving. This is also true on the individual level. It is even reflected in laws the feelings, the thinking of morality in people. But it's in laws. But forget the laws for a second. People, just ordinary intelligence, has a different feel when they hear that murder was committed by somebody, an individual, on the basis that they killed somebody to get food. Now you may still say, Jesus, we can't have that. We got laws against it, and I personally don't like it. But wait a minute. But to hear that somebody killed over food, or to hear that somebody killed over sex, which is some of you may or may not know in some of the civilized world, even in this century, there's still remnants of it. It was known as the unwritten law. And in Europe, a man cuckold like that he could kill his wife's lover, and if it was a known fact, all he had to do was prove in court that some of his neighbors said, yeah, she was sleeping with this guy that he killed. They'd let him go. Justifiable. It gets down to, and of course we're not talking about just the secondary pleasures of sex. Now I'm making reference to, surely you understand, the kind of healthy procreation inherent in the right kind of man, a good healthy man and woman being drugged together, and then the need at certain times and certain places for an apparently cohesive family. When it gets down to the level like food and shelter, individuals can kill one another, and the general thinking in other humans is one thing about that, but it's something else to hear that one guy killed another because he insulted his shoes. Or one guy killed another when they found out that UCLA did not get in the NCAA playoffs, that they were discussing the possible merits of the Mets this year in a bar, and one guy stabbed another, and his defense is, well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in your honor, you should have heard what he said about the Mets. I'm talking about the Mets. And people think a different way. The nervous system responds a different way if he says, my shoes, are these neat shoes or not? And that guy laughed at him. When it gets down to that level, men think differently. All of this is known, but what I'm trying to get you to do is be able to tie this together. It has to do with my current mapping out of these differences of the levels of primary and secondary purposes. Large numbers of people, individuals, apparently can inflict mayhem on other large groups, or on another individual, and the collective conversation of humans, at least in some area at some time, has one specific thought about it if it seemed to have been done on a primary basis over food, healthy sex, the continuation of the family, the protection of the people, just the primary level of some group of people or some individuals involved. There is one thinking of it, one reaction to it. But then, when it seems to be that was done on something other than the primary level, it could still be tenuously connected with food, that one guy killed another guy. And it comes out in court what happened. He was a dinner guest, and the murderer had worked all day to prepare this certain kind of North Minnesota inverted moose dish, and the deceased tasted it and made fun of it and began to ridicule him, and so, Your Honor, I had to shoot him. That is not the same. It is just simply not that a guy killed, and even he admits, he can't deny it, that he killed. I was starving and I asked this guy for food. He had something, he wouldn't give it to me, and I began to fight with him, and he fought back, and I killed him, there's no doubt. But I was about to die anyway, I did it. Do you hear me? For the fourth time tonight, I'm glad. No, I'm not glad. I tried my best. I'm changing the sarcastic route tonight. I tried my best once I began to get a glimmer of this. I tried my best to think, surely this has some kind of personal, potential significance to an individual. And I thought, and I stayed up all night, and I worried. And I just couldn't think of any, so I guess we'll stop.